wake up. You go through the motions. You handle what needs to be handled. And yet, something feels wrong. Not dramatic, just wrong. You look in the mirror, and you still look like you. Your life may even seem mostly normal from the outside. But inside, something feels distant. And the hardest part is that you can't always explain why. You just know that the version of you that used to feel more alive doesn't feel fully here anymore. And maybe you've been trying to figure out what happened. Maybe you think stress did it, or pain, or perhaps disappointment, or maybe life just wore you down. But what if that's not the full story? What if the reason you don't feel like yourself anymore is because the version of yourself is starting to crack? In this video, we're going to talk about why this feeling shows up, what it actually means, and why it may be less of a breakdown than you think. Because when people say, "I don't feel like myself anymore," what they usually mean is this: the identity I used to live through isn't holding me together the way it used to. And that matters. Because most people spend their lives trying to get the old version back. But sometimes the old version was never your truth. It was just your coping pattern, your survival shape, your social mask, your mental construct. And when that starts falling apart, it feels unsettling. But it may also be the beginning of something far more real. A lot of people think they've lost themselves, when in reality, they've lost the role they were used to playing. And when life shifts, when pressure builds, that role stops fitting the same way. That doesn't mean you disappeared. It means the mask is getting heavier. And what makes this confusing is that roles can feel like identity after wearing them long enough. So when they begin to collapse, it feels personal. It feels like, what happened to me? But the truth is, what happened may not be lost. It may be exposure. You may be seeing, for the first time, how much of your life was built around being the one you thought you had to be. Another reason you don't feel like yourself anymore is simple. You are mentally and emotionally overloaded. When your system has been carrying too much for too long, your inner experience starts to dull. Not because your essence is gone, but because your nervous system is exhausted. You stop feeling sharp. You stop feeling inspired. You stop feeling connected to your own depth. And then the mind steps in and tells you a story. It says, you're broken. Or it says, you lost something. Or perhaps, you need to get back to who you were. But sometimes who you were was just a person running on momentum. And now the momentum is gone. So what you're feeling is not necessarily the loss of self. It may be the collapse of overstimulation. It may be the moment where all the noise is no longer strong enough to distract you from what's actually going on inside. That silence can feel empty at first. But empty is not always bad. Sometimes, empty is just what remains when the false activity stops. This is where the real tension begins. Part of you already knows something is changing, but the mind wants to reverse it. It wants the familiar version back, even if that version was anxious, disconnected, and running on autopilot. Why? Because the familiar feels safer than the unknown. So even if your old identity was built on pressure, people-pleasing, or overthinking, the mind still clings to it because it knows how to operate there. That's why this phase feels strange. You're not fully inside the old self anymore, but you're not yet stable in what's deeper. So you feel caught between two worlds. You're too aware to go back, too uncertain to fully let go, too honest to fake it like before, too unsettled to trust what's emerging. That in-between space is uncomfortable, but it's also sacred, because that is the space where illusion starts losing its grip. What you are beneath all of the roles has not gone away. The quiet center beneath all mental movement has not disappeared. The monad has not left you. What's actually happening is the false center you used to organize your life around is weakening. And when that happens, the mind panics. Because the mind only knows how to function through story, comparison, and control. It needs a character to manage. So when the character starts feeling unstable, it interprets that as danger. But the monad is not the character. It is not the story about who you are. It is the silent reality prior to all of that. The presence that remains when the performance drops. The awareness that is still here even when your confidence changes. The deeper life in you that does not depend on having a stable identity to be real. So if you don't feel like yourself anymore, maybe that's because what you used to call yourself was never your deepest center to begin with. This shows up in ordinary moments more than people realize. It looks like sitting in your car after work and feeling so drained you can't even turn the radio on. It looks like being around friends and family and feeling absent, like part of you isn't fully there. It looks like trying to fix yourself and secretly getting more exhausted every time you try. But here's the shift. Stop trying to force the old self back online. Stop measuring your aliveness by how well you perform your old identity. Stop assuming that unfamiliar means wrong. Instead, get still enough to notice what remains when you stop performing. Notice the awareness behind the confusion. Notice the quiet presence beneath the fatigue. Notice that even when your identity feels unstable, something deeper is still here, watching, breathing, existing. That's the beginning of return. Not returning to the old self, but returning to what is real before your self-image. So no, you may not feel like yourself anymore, but that doesn't automatically mean that something is wrong. It may mean that something false is falling away. It may mean that the identity that you lived through is no longer strong enough to contain what is trying to emerge. And yes, that can feel uncomfortable. It can feel empty, unfamiliar, and deeply unsettling. But sometimes the reason life feels so strange is not because you are losing yourself. It's because you are getting close to something more real than the self you were trained to be. So don't rush to rebuild the mask. Don't panic just because the old inner shape is no longer holding. Stay honest. Stay still. Stay present. Because what you truly are does not vanish when identity shakes. It just becomes easier to notice. There's a version of you you keep thinking about. The old you. The one who felt normal. The one who felt alive in a way that felt effortless. And no matter what you do, you can't get back there. You try to recreate it. You try to think like you used to. Act like you used to. Care about the same things. But it doesn't land the same anymore. Something feels off. And here's the truth most people won't tell you. You're not failing to go back. You've already moved beyond that. This is where it gets confusing. Because from the outside, your life might look fine. Nothing is necessarily wrong. But internally, there's a disconnect. Things that used to excite you feel flat. Things that used to matter feel distant. Even the way you used to see yourself feels outdated. So your mind does what it always does. It tries to fix it. Maybe I just need to get disciplined again. Maybe I need to find my old drive. Maybe something is wrong with me. But no matter how hard you push, you can't force yourself back into a version of you that no longer fits. And that's where the real frustration begins. Because it feels like you're losing yourself, when in reality, you're losing something you've already outgrown. Here's the shift that changes everything. What if the problem isn't that you changed, but that you're trying to undo the change? What if the discomfort you feel isn't a sign that something is wrong, but a sign that something is no longer true? Because the old version of you was built on a certain way of seeing life, a certain set of assumptions, patterns, and reactions. And now, you're starting to see through them. Not fully, not clearly all the time, but enough that you can't go back to being unconscious inside of them. And that's why it feels uncomfortable. Because you're no longer fully identified, but you haven't fully stabilized in something deeper yet. You're in between. This is the part most people miss. They think growth is becoming something better. But in reality, real change feels more like losing something familiar. You're not becoming a new person. You're shedding what was never stable to begin with. And that creates a strange space. A space where you don't fully relate to your past self anymore. But you also don't fully understand what you are now. So the mind tries to grab onto the past, because at least it was predictable, even if it wasn't peaceful. But here's the truth. You can't unknow what you've started to see. Even if you try to distract yourself, even if you try to force old habits, there's a subtle awareness now, and it won't let you go fully back. And this is where something deeper begins to show itself. Not as an idea, not as a belief, but as a quiet presence behind everything. You might notice it in small moments. When you stop trying so hard. When your mind gets quiet for a second. When you're just sitting there, not chasing anything. There's something still there, unbothered and unchanging. It doesn't need the old identity. It doesn't need the old version of you, because it was never that to begin with. What you're actually starting to sense is the part of you that isn't built from memory, habits, or roles. And once you begin to notice that, going back stops making sense. Because what you're moving toward is more real than what you are trying to return to. The real struggle isn't change. It's attachment to what felt familiar. You're not trying to go back because it was better. You're trying to go back because it was known. Because your mind could predict it, control it, and understand it. But what you're stepping into now doesn't work like that. It's less controlled. It's less defined. But it's also more honest. The old version of you was maintained through patterns. It was maintained through your reactions, your conditioning, your unquestioned beliefs. And now those patterns are breaking. So of course it feels unstable. But instability doesn't mean you're lost. It means you're no longer locked into something false. This shows up in simple, everyday ways. You scroll through things that used to entertain you and feel nothing. You try to force motivation, and it doesn't stick. You revisit old habits, and they feel empty or forced. You think about who you used to be, and it feels distant. And here's where most people go wrong. They try to fix it by going backward. More force, more pressure, more trying to recreate something that's already done. That's why it feels worse. So here's the shift. Stop trying to go back. Let the old version of you be done. Not with resistance. Not with regret. Just let it be over. And instead of trying to figure out who you're becoming, start noticing what's here when you stop forcing anything. The quiet moments, the space between thoughts, the awareness that's still present even when everything feels uncertain. You don't need to rush into a new identity. You need to get comfortable without one. That's where something real starts to stabilize. You can't go back to who you used to be, because that version of you was never meant to last. It served its purpose. It got you here. But now, you're starting to see beyond it. And even though that feels uncomfortable, it's also the beginning of something more real than anything you've known before. Not something you become, but something you recognize. There's a pattern in your life that keeps repeating, but somehow the feeling stays the same. And after a while, you start asking yourself, why does this keep happening to me? But here's the deeper truth. You're not trapped in a pattern because life is against you. You're trapped in a pattern because something in you still cannot see what it's participating in. And until that becomes visible, the pattern will keep repeating. In this video, We're going to talk about the pattern you can't seem to escape until you finally see it clearly. Not just the pattern in your relationships, not just the pattern in your emotions, not just the pattern in your reactions, but the deeper structure underneath all of it. Because most people think they are stuck in circumstances, but what they are actually stuck in is identification. They keep meeting life through the same unconscious lens, then wonder why reality keeps reflecting the same lessons back to them. The pattern is not just out there. The pattern is being generated through the way the separate self keeps meeting reality. The moment that becomes clear, something shifts. Not because life suddenly changes overnight, but because you are no longer blindly feeding what keeps repeating. Most people think the pattern is the event. They say things like, "I always attract the wrong person. I always end up getting overlooked. I always fail when I get close." But the outer event is not the deepest pattern. The deeper pattern is emotional. Maybe it's the feeling of not being chosen, or the fear of not being safe, or perhaps the tension of needing control. That emotional structure becomes the hidden script through which your life is met. And once that script is active, you start seeing through it. That's why the same lesson can show up in your love life, in your work life, in your inner world all at once. Because the pattern is not just what happens. It is in the state from which you keep meeting what happens. This is where people get stuck. They start believing the pattern is proof that life has cursed them, that reality is unfair, that they are doomed to keep reliving the same pain. But most repeating patterns are not punishment. They're unconscious participation. That doesn't mean you caused everything that happened to you. It doesn't mean every painful thing was your fault. That would be shallow and false. It means something in you is still responding from the same wounded position, and that position keeps recreating similar outcomes. You may keep choosing from fear. You may keep speaking from insecurity. You may keep chasing validation from people who cannot give it. You may keep abandoning yourself the moment tension enters the room. Then life mirrors back the same result. Not to torture you, but to reveal what is still unseen. Reality often repeats the lesson until your awareness becomes greater than your reaction. Here's the uncomfortable part. Part of you may actually need the pattern. Not because you enjoy suffering, but because the familiar pain of the false self feels safer than the unknown freedom beyond it. The separate self is built out of memory, identity, and survival. It clings to what it knows, even if what it knows is painful. So if you have built an identity around being rejected, misunderstood, or betrayed, then breaking the pattern doesn't just feel hopeful. It feels threatening. Because now the mind has to release a version of you it has been protecting for years. This is why people often say they want change, while unconsciously recreating the same emotional environment. The old identity would rather suffer in what's familiar than dissolve into what it cannot control. And this is where the monad shows up. Because the monad in you is not the wounded identity. It is not the defensive pattern. It is not the story of what always happens to you. It is the silent awareness beneath it all. The part of you that has never been trapped, only overlooked. A lot of people try to escape their pattern by thinking harder. They analyze every conversation. They replay every mistake. They study themselves endlessly. They keep trying to figure it all out. But the pattern is rarely broken by more mental noise, because over-analysis often happens inside the pattern itself. You're still looking from the same lens, with just more words. Real seeing happens in presence. It happens when the reaction begins, and you notice it. When the tightening happens, and you feel it. When the old story rises, and you don't immediately obey it. That moment matters more than hours of analysis. Because now, you are no longer completely fused with the pattern. You're witnessing it. And once you can witness it, you have already become more than it. That's the beginning of freedom. Not when the pattern disappears instantly, but when it is no longer running you into total darkness. Most people think escape means finally getting the right situation, the right relationship, the right job, the right version of themselves. But the deepest escape is not circumstantial. It's perceptual. You begin to notice that what you truly are is prior to the pattern. It's prior to the emotion. It's prior to the fear. It's prior to the identity built around repetition. This doesn't mean you deny your humanity. It doesn't mean you pretend pain does not exist. It means you stop reducing yourself to the loop you have been living in. You start meeting your new experience from a deeper ground. And from there, something profound happens. The same trigger appears, but you do not move the same way. The same invitation appears, but you do not betray yourself in the same way. The same fear arises, but you do not automatically hand it the steering wheel. Now, the pattern begins to starve, because it cannot survive without your unconscious identification. This is hidden liberation. You don't escape the pattern by force. You escape it by seeing that what you are is deeper than the self it keeps repeating. That's the monad, the quiet center beneath the loop, the stillness beneath the reaction, the wholeness beneath the fractured story. And once you begin to live from there, the pattern loses its power to define your life. So if something in your life keeps repeating, don't rush to call yourself broken. Don't assume that you're cursed. And don't assume nothing will ever change. Look deeper. What feeling keeps returning? What identity keeps getting reactivated? What reaction keeps taking over before awareness can enter? Because the pattern is not here to condemn you. It's here to reveal the place where you are still unconscious of your own participation and still disconnected from what you truly are. And the moment you see that clearly, the repetition begins to crack. Not all at once, not with drama, but with truth. The kind of truth that does not come from theory. The kind that comes from finally noticing. There is something in you that has been watching the whole pattern the entire time. And that is what you are. Not the loop. Not the wounds. Not the repetition. But the awareness beneath it all. That's where the shift begins. That's where the false cycle ends. That's where the monad is no longer a concept, but a living recognition. Something feels off, but you can't explain why. You're still you, but not in the same way. The thoughts are there. The personality is still there. Your life hasn't disappeared. And yet, something doesn't feel as solid as it used to. Almost like you're watching yourself instead of being yourself. And that feeling, most people ignore it. But that's the moment that truth begins to reveal itself. You try to fix it. You try to find yourself again. You think maybe you need more clarity, direction, and purpose. So you look at your habits, your mindset, and your emotions. You try to rebuild a stronger version of who you are. But no matter how much you improve things, that subtle feeling doesn't go away. Because what's shifting isn't your life. It's your identity. And identity doesn't collapse loudly. It loosens quietly. What if the problem isn't that you're losing yourself? What if the problem is that you've been holding on to something that was never stable to begin with? Because identity feels real, but it's built. It's memory. It's repetition. It's patterns that become familiar enough to feel like truth. I'm this kind of person. I've always been this way. That's just who I am. But all of that was learned. It was reinforced. It was repeated. So when it starts to shift, it doesn't mean that you're breaking. It means you're beginning to see. You've already noticed this before. In small moments, when you reacted differently than you normally would, when something that used to trigger you didn't, when you stepped outside of your usual patterns, even for a moment. And in that moment, who were you? Because if your identity was fixed, that wouldn't be possible. Something deeper was there. Something not tied to the pattern. Something not tied to the role. Something not tied to the story. You didn't become someone new in those moments. You just weren't locked into the version you usually play. That space, that quiet awareness behind the version of you that comes and goes. That's what this is pointing to. Not your personality, not your past, not the voice in your head, but the simple fact that you're here, aware, before any of that forms. That's the monad. It's not something you reach. It's something you notice. Because even right now, thoughts are moving. Feelings are shifting. Identity is subtly adjusting. But something is still here, watching it all. Unaffected, unchanging, and present. The illusion isn't that identity exists. It's that identity is what you are. And that's where the tension comes from. Because the mind tries to stabilize something that was never meant to be permanent. So it defends it, maintains it, repeats it, even when it hurts. But once you see that identity is just a pattern, you don't have to fight it, and you don't have to protect it. You can let it move, let it shift, let it change without turning it into me. This is why certain things hit you so hard, like criticism or rejection, like feeling misunderstood. It's not just the moment. It's what it threatens. The identity that you've been holding. But notice what happens when you don't immediately defend it. When you don't rush to prove something. When you don't reinforce the story. There's a gap. A small one. But it's there. And in that gap, there's no identity to protect. There's only awareness. Still, unbothered, clear awareness. That's the shift. Not becoming someone new, but no longer being trapped as someone. You're not losing yourself. You're seeing through what you thought yourself to be. And that's why it feels so unstable. Because identity was never meant to be permanent. It was something you used. Something you learned. Something you wore. But not something that you are. And the moment you stop trying to hold it all together, something more simple starts to reveal itself. Not louder, not more dramatic, just present. The monad. The quiet presence that never needed a name. There's a moment you've probably felt recently where you stop and think, something's off. I don't feel like myself anymore. And it doesn't feel small. It feels like you're slipping. Like pieces of you are disappearing. But what if the truth is this? You're not losing yourself. You're losing what was never truly you to begin with. In this video, we're going to walk through why this feeling shows up and why it feels so unsettling. Because on the surface, it feels like something is wrong. But underneath, this is often the beginning of something very real. Not a breakdown, but a shift. And once you see what's actually happening, you stop trying to fix it and start understanding it. Your sense of self didn't just appear. It was built, piece by piece, through experiences, reactions, and expectations. Who you thought you had to be, how you learned to respond, what you told yourself about who you are. And for a long time, it worked. It gave you structure. It gave you direction. It gave you a sense of stability. But here's the problem. It wasn't built on something permanent. So when life changes, when pressure builds, when awareness starts to deepen, that structure begins to crack. And it doesn't feel like change. It feels like loss. Things you used to do without thinking start to feel off. Conversations feel forced. Reactions feel unnatural. Even your own thoughts don't land the same way they used to. And this creates confusion. Why can't I just be how I was before? But that's the wrong question. Because what's happening is this. You're becoming aware of patterns you were previously unconscious of. And once you see something clearly, you can't fully go back into it the same way. That's why it feels uncomfortable. You're no longer fully inside the pattern, but you're not fully free from it either. You're in between. Before, your thoughts felt like you. Now, there's distance. You notice them more. You question them. Sometimes you even feel disconnected from them. And that can feel unsettling, like you're losing your grip. But here's what's actually happening. You're beginning to see that your thoughts are not your foundation. They're just activity. And when that realization starts, there's a gap. A space between what arises and what you are. That space feels unfamiliar at first, almost like emptiness. But it's not emptiness. It's clarity without noise. You've been playing roles your entire life. The responsible one, the strong one, the one who holds it together, the one who reacts a certain way. But now, those roles don't feel as solid. You can still play them, but they don't feel like you anymore. And that creates a strange feeling. If I'm not this, then what am I? That question can feel destabilizing, because your mind wants a clear answer, a fixed identity. But what's happening is deeper than that. You're starting to see that you were never limited to those roles in the first place. This stage feels like confusion, like instability, like something is missing. But it's actually this: the space between what you used to believe and what you're beginning to recognize. And that space can feel empty, because your mind hasn't filled it yet. But that's the opportunity. Because if you rush to fill it, you go right back to where you were. But if you stay with it, without forcing an answer, something quieter starts to become noticeable. Not a new identity, not a new belief, just a simple awareness that was there the entire time. So, if you feel like you're losing yourself, take a step back and look again. You're still here. You're aware. You're noticing all of this happening. That hasn't gone anywhere. And that's the point. Because what you are was never the thing that's changing. Most people think the self is who they are. Their personality, their memories, their likes, their dislikes, their wounds and habits. But if that were true, why does the self feel so unstable? Why can it change so drastically depending on who you're around? Why does it break under pressure? Why does it collapse in grief, inflate in praise, shrink in shame, and constantly need to be defended? Because what you call the self is usually not what you are. And the moment that starts becoming clear, life begins to feel very different. Not because you become someone new, but because you stop mistaking movement for identity. In this video, we're going to talk about the difference between the monad and the self. And this is not what most people think it is. This is not a battle between your higher self and your lower self. This is not about destroying your personality. This is not about becoming empty, emotionless, or detached from life. It's much simpler than that. The self is the structure you learn to move through life with. The monad is what remains before and beyond that structure. And if you don't see the difference, you will spend your whole life trying to fix and perfect something that was never stable to begin with. But once you do see it, something relaxes. Because you stop trying to become real through what was only temporary. The self most people know is built. It is shaped through conditioning. You are given a name, a role, a history, a set of expectations, ways you were rewarded, ways you were rejected, things you learned to hide, things you learned to perform. And over time, these patterns got woven together into a sense of me. And because you've been living through that structure for so long, it feels personal. It feels like identity itself. But look closely. The self is always adjusting. It changes depending on who you're with. It hardens when threatened. It performs when watched. It retreats when wounded. It compares, protects, explains, and reacts. That doesn't make it evil. It makes it unstable. The self is functional. It helps you to navigate the world. But it is not the deepest truth of what you are. It is the costume consciousness learned to move through in life. And the problem begins when you think the costume is the wearer. The monad is not a better version of the self. This is where people get confused. They imagine the monad as some perfected identity, some enlightened personality, some spiritual image of themselves with all the mess removed. But the monad is not an improved self-image. It's not a concept. It's not a role. It's not a personal storyline upgraded with sacred language. The monad was never constructed in the first place. It does not depend on memory. It does not depend on mood. It does not depend on approval. It does not become more real when you feel peaceful or less real when you feel lost. It is the quiet, indivisible reality that remains before the mind starts dividing life into me and my experience. You do not create it. You do not earn it. You do not build it through effort. You notice it when the constant pressure to maintain yourself begins to loosen. The monad is not another version of you to achieve. It is what has been here the entire time, while every version of you came and went. The self feels heavy because it must constantly be maintained. It has to keep the story going. It has to defend the image. It has to make sense of the past. It has to predict the future. It has to prove worth. It has to avoid humiliation. It has to stay in control. This is why so many people are exhausted, even when nothing dramatic is happening. They are not only living life, they are carrying a psychological structure every moment of the day and trying to keep it intact. Every interaction becomes loaded. Every mistake feels personal. Every opinion feels threatening. And every loss feels like identity damage. That's the burden of living as the self. Not because the self is bad, but because anything constructed has to be constantly reinforced. And eventually, life starts exposing that instability. You go through heartbreak, through failure, through disappointment, through burnout, in a strange period where your old motivations stop working. And suddenly, the self doesn't feel as solid as it used to. That moment is uncomfortable, but it's also sacred. Because what feels like losing yourself is often the first crack in what was never truly you. Realization usually doesn't begin with a mystical vision. It begins in ordinary moments. A moment where you almost react, but something in you sees the reaction before it takes over. A moment where you feel shame rise up, but you notice it instead of becoming it. A moment where the mind starts narrating who you are, what went wrong, what this means about you, and suddenly, you see that narration happening. That gap matters, because in that moment, something deeper than the self is present. not as a thought, not as a belief, but as direct recognition. You start to see that the self is appearing within awareness. It is not the source of awareness. You can watch insecurity come and go. You can watch anger form and dissolve. You can watch identities activate in certain situations and disappear in others. What sees all of that is not trapped inside of it. This is where the difference between the monad and the self becomes real. The self is what appears. The monad is the underlying wholeness in which it appears. And when this becomes lived, rather than merely understood, the obsession with defending yourself begins to weaken. You still function. You still have a personality. You still make choices. But now, there is space. And in that space, life stops feeling like a nonstop identity emergency. A lot of people hear this kind of teaching and swing too far. They think the goal is to erase the self completely. But it's not. You don't need to destroy your personality. You don't need to suppress your humanity. You don't need to reject your preferences, your style, or your story. The self is not the enemy. The mistake is identification. The problem is not that the self exists. The problem is that you confuse it for your essence. When that confusion softens, the self can finally take its proper place. It becomes a tool instead of a prison. A way of expressing through life instead of a false center you must constantly protect. You stop asking the self to give you permanence. You stop asking the mind to give you wholeness. You stop asking identity to solve the ache that only truth can dissolve. And from there, life becomes simpler. Not because all problems vanish, but because the deepest part of you is no longer entangled in every passing form. The self can move. The self can change. The self can heal. The self can mature. But the monad was never damaged by any of it. So, the monad versus the self is not really a conflict. It's a confusion. The self is the structure. The monad is the reality. The self is shaped by life. The monad is prior to every shape. The self changes constantly. The monad doesn't come and go. And this is why the search for identity never fully satisfies. Because no matter how refined the self becomes, it still cannot become the wholeness that you already are. That is why this isn't what you think it is. This is not about becoming someone better. It's about recognizing what has never depended on becoming at all. And once that begins to register, even faintly, you start living differently. Less defended. Less performative. Less trapped in the pressure to maintain a false center. Not because you have figured yourself out completely, but because you have begun to notice that what you are is deeper than every version of yourself the mind can describe. If this journey spoke to you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone ready to experience life beyond thought. Comment below. Have you been mistaking your self-image for what you really are? I read every comment. If you would like to support my work directly, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/MagnumOpus333. Or you can explore some original merchandise at my Teespring store online. The link is in the description below. Remember, your consciousness is the key that unlocks reality. Let's keep unlocking it together. Thank you for watching. Until next time.